Welcome to this session of the International Macro History Online Seminar. I'm David Todd. I'm one of the directors of the Center for History and Economics at Cambridge. And it is my great pleasure today to moderate a presentation by Tracy Dennison. Tracy is a professor of social sciences history at Caltech, and she's currently a visiting researcher in the Department of Economic History at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And to remind the invisible audience about the rules of engagement, please ask your questions in the Q&A space, not in the chat box. And I will pass them on to Tracy at the end of the talk. You can ask clarification questions, flag them as such, please, in the Q&A space. But I'll only interrupt the speaker if there are really, clarifications that need to be answered immediately. So over to Tracy. The presentation is based on her current book project, which promises to be a very important book on institutions. And the title is State Capacity and the Rise and Fall of Serfdom in Europe. So the screen is yours, Tracy.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Nathan and Rui for the invitation to present in this forum. Let me share my screen. Okay, good. So yes, what I'm going to talk about today is work in progress. It's a book project with many interlocking parts that are hard to present as discrete chapters. So what you're going to get is kind of the tip of the iceberg. It's a larger picture that's starting to emerge from the synthesis of the evidence. And it suggests a slightly different way of thinking about serfdom based on a comparison of the institutional underpinnings of serfdom in Russia and in Prussia, and the lead up to and aftermath of emancipation in these two societies. I think that this suggestive, I'll say it's a suggestive picture that I'm going to paint for you, does extend beyond these two societies, so beyond the second serfdom to other parts of Europe, hence the more general title of the talk. So it's not a total bait and switch, just a little one. So the project started with two basic questions, both of which emerged from my earlier micro-level study of Russian serfdom. The first is, how do the estate-level observations that I presented in the institutional framework of Russian serfdom fit into a larger political economy of serfdom? And the second is, why did the 1861 Emancipation Act in Russia make so little difference to the long-term institutional equilibrium? So why did so little change? And to be clear, I'm not talking here about short-term gains. So the economic effects of emancipation, described most recently by Markievicz and Zhuravsky, for instance, are not incompatible with the larger story I want to tell today, which focuses more on distributional effects than the size of the surpluses or the overall size of the pie. Another way of putting this is the Russian crown pushed ahead on emancipation because it expected to gain from loosening nobles' hold on the peasant population, so to expand the tax base. But it didn't turn out that way for reasons I'll discuss shortly. And they had to go back to the drawing board and design another major land reform in 1906, so essentially admitting that the 1861 version didn't achieve its aims. It would help a great deal if I could present data to you on Russian state revenues over the centuries to underscore this point. Those in the audience who work on Imperial Russia know what a challenge a comprehensive study of Russian fiscal capacity presents, and how the difficulty in finding those data is actually endogenous to the problem of weak capacity. So when I talk later about poor administrative and fiscal capacity, know that the archive bears this out. There's no one place, or even two places, or even three places to go and find these data. It's a major excavation project, I think, which is still awaiting its team of researchers. So a clear contrast to the Russian case is Prussia, so within the context of the so-called second serfdom. Between the Peace of Westphalia and the 1807 October Edict, Prussia underwent a significant institutional shift whereby a stronger, more centralized state emerges, so that when serfdom's eventually abolished over the course of the 19th century, the political economy of Prussia looks quite different from that in the late 17th century. And this is a well-known story, I think to the point of cliche even. The comparative trajectories of these two societies seem worth investigating to try and understand why we observe such different outcomes. So what I'm going to be talking about in the remaining time, or the story I'm going to tell, will involve telling you a number of things you already know, but putting them together in a different way to tell a slightly different story. So to summarize, I'm going to be arguing that the role of the state is key to understanding the institutional context of serfdom. So serfdom is a weak state equilibrium. A ruler must make concessions to other powerful actors to obtain services, administrative services, revenues, cooperation. Serfdom poses constraints on the fiscal aims of the crown. In order to loosen these constraints, the state's got to be able to perform the administrative functions that its noble agents are performing in exchange for their privileges. This happens gradually over the 17th to 19th centuries in Prussia and earlier in much of Western Europe. So the decline of serfdom reflects underlying institutional reconfigurations. In Russia, serfdom's formally abolished, but the state remains weak vis-a-vis these other groups with limited options for surplus extraction. I'm going to be highlighting a key difference between these two outcomes, between these two states, and that is the role of law, the role of legal practices and procedures, processes, especially enforcement of property rights, which emerges as an important tool, I will argue, for states in Western and Central Europe, but not in Russia. And I think that this suggestive finding, as I'm calling it for now, has implications for our understanding of origins or evolution of inclusive or open access institutions and the emergence of strong central states in Europe. Okay. Models of serfdom tend to focus on labor dynamics between landlords and peasants, but serfdom was part of a larger institutional system, a larger set of negotiations. This diagram is not comprehensive, and one could break it down further, especially on the right-hand side, but it's mainly to convey the impression that the landholding elite were not the only ones the crown was contracting with. The state, or the crown, the ruler, I'm using these interchangeably throughout, though I realize that talking about a state could be considered anachronistic in certain contexts, made concessions to a number of different competing entities in exchange for things that it needed. That might be loans, cash advances, tax collection services, military service, other forms of administration, or even just oaths of loyalty. So, in order to persuade your rivals not to try and overthrow the crown. The number and the relative strength of these competing groups in any local society contributed to the institutional framework itself, and it's going to be different from place to place. This is just an example of how this might look, and all of these interactions, all of these deals cut between the state and these different groups affected other parts of the society, which is why I have the line running through the groups on the right-hand side. So for instance, if the state grants merchants a monopoly on the grain trade, which enables them to set prices for grain, it's going to have an impact on demesne farming and the revenues of noble landlords and peasants. Monopolies of craft guilds, for instance, can affect what kinds of activities serfs are allowed to engage in on estates. Now, if we wanted to extend this back to medieval Europe, it would have to look something like this, with a separate block for the church, which had its own sources of political and economic power, including serfs and land and rights of taxation. And it was very much in competition with local rulers for surpluses. looking at post-Reformation Prussia and Russia, it doesn't eliminate the church altogether from the calculation, but since the relationship between the state and church is very different by this time, I think it's less problematic to focus on the other constraints. Go back here, yep. So even though I'm focusing on noble landlords and peasants, this framing here of the different groups, the different possible constraints on the state is important for understanding the problem that I'm addressing in this project, which is not, as in most studies of serfdom, labor constraints of landlords or mobility constraints or labor allocation constraints of peasants, but how the ruler in a weak state configuration can command a greater share of the surpluses in order to extricate him or herself from these different concessions, the constraints that these different concessions place on their fiscal ambitions. And serfdom is just one of these constraints, and it's the one I'm focusing on. Or as I put this jokingly to a colleague recently, I find myself going from writing a book on why peasants were powerless under serfdom to writing a book about why the state was powerless under serfdom, which means that the trilogy is going to have to involve a third book from the point of view of the Sheremetyev family. So some key points and caveats. So in this configuration, the state concedes privileges to different groups, all of which, including the state itself, are competing for surpluses. The state concedes things in exchange for administrative tasks it can't accomplish on its own, for revenue, for loans, for loyalty. These groups are not monolithic, nor is the state. So there is intra-elite conflict, there's internal conflict, and there can be shifting alliances. So this framework doesn't depend on any specific configuration. I often refer to this as an institutional equilibrium that has to change in order for serfdom to end. But what I'm going to be describing is really a system in disequilibrium, where there's constant fluctuations at the margin and a constant conflict beneath the surface. So these concessions over time become too constraining for the state. But in order to access the rents it's conceded to others, it has to be in a position to do without the services or the revenues it's obtaining through these negotiations. And I think it's really important to make clear that I'm not at any point implying that success is a once and for all sort of thing. So the state's the state manages to gain power over noble landlords and revoke some of their privileges. That doesn't mean that noble landlords, of course, cease to be a power in that society. Things shift, so they may exercise their power in other fora, through other channels. It's more about this particular battle over these particular rents. Okay. So I mentioned the project focuses on the subset of this complex set of relationships, that between the state, landlords, and peasants. And that is the case for most studies of serfdom. Existing models of serfdom tend to focus on labor dynamics, so mainly landlords and peasants. And mobility restrictions are assumed to have the power of the state behind them. So the state is lurking in the background, even if it's not always fully incorporated. And that's the case with these coercive aspects. I think in Domar's 1970 paper, he refers to endogenous political variables that are necessary to explain the exceptions to his model that emphasizes land-labor ratios. The problem is that states didn't really have the administrative capacity or the resources to enforce serfdom. So the Russian case that Domar bases his model on is an interesting case in point. The tensions in this literature come through here. The standard story is that the Ulozhenie of 1649, which formalizes serfdom, comes into existence because it turns out that the servitor class of nobles is not showing up for campaigns. And when they're asked why they're not turning up to perform their military service, they say, well, if we leave our serfs, we'll seek greener pastures, so to speak. And so the solution to this is for the state to say, aha, okay, well, we won't let your serfs leave. And that is not, this is backing up. This is a state that can't get its military, it can't get its nobles to turn up for military service, but it's going to enforce mobility restrictions on the ground. This is not likely. And the way that they deal with this is to make enforcement part of this package of concessions. So there are formal restrictions on mobility, and I'm not implying that the fact that they're formalized is irrelevant, or that there might, appealing to the state should there be a conflict between nobles is not important. The thing is, we know very little about how this worked in practice. What we do see in the sources, and this comes up in the Prussian literature as well, is that there are constant complaints about lack of compliance, or serfs exercising freedom of mobility, and there doesn't seem to be. It seems to be very difficult to get them to stop leaving if they want to leave. And so what the state does is, and this is the case in all forms of serfdom throughout Europe, is give landlords the power to enforce mobility restrictions. So this is the monopoly on justice that the seigneurial courts have. Not only can they enforce the rules of their estate, but they can set strong disincentives for leaving. They can punish, they can fine, they can set up systems that make them essentially the little sovereign princes of their territories. And this particular concession is what gives serfdom its coercive, oppressive character, and makes it more than just a tenurial contract. And I think that the concession itself, these powers of enforcement, had different implications depending on the institutional endowment, the existing institutional endowment of the society when serfdom arose. So in Russia, this effectively meant that landlords were, as I said before, the sovereign princes of their own territory. In the words of one historian, state power ended at the manor gate in Russia. So serfs had essentially no formal legal rights. Before the mid-19th century, they couldn't own property in their own names. They couldn't transact with free persons. They did not have recourse against landlords. There's a period during which they can petition the crown. That's ended in the 18th century, or recourse against other free people. Landlords were legally prohibited from killing their serfs, though the enforcement of this is not entirely clear. They could raise obligations, implement new ones. They could shift serf labor from agriculture to industry, to trade, to migrant labor. This is something that makes Russian serfdom really different from European serfdom. It's just the flexibility. They could adapt the rent-seeking practices to the economic conditions and then shift back again. They could buy and sell serfs without land. They could transfer them among their different estates. I note here later, prohibition of this practice seems to have been unenforced. At least the estate documents I've studied do not give any indication that this prohibition existed even. We see this practice going on right into the end. Landlords in Russia were responsible for collecting state taxes, organizing conscription, resolving local disputes, welfare provision, and keeping order. And a very powerful landholding oligarchy benefited from this, and I would say at the expense of at the expense of the crown. So the Sheremetyev family, whose estates I've studied, owned 50 plus estates across 17 provinces and were landlords to some 350,000 serfs. And so from the point of view of the Tsar, competitors this rich and this powerful are always going to be a bit of a threat. And it's going to be very difficult to revoke privileges that they've been given. Serfdom in Prussia was different in that noble landlords' powers were still very great, but they were constrained by a system of formal property rights and the existence of legal mechanisms for conflict resolution. And this is similar to other societies to the West. I'll talk about this a bit more later, where we see these things in play, especially in the late medieval period. Serfdom was still a tenurial relationship. So both state taxes and feudal obligations attached to the landholding. And it was still, for these reasons, serfdom was largely an agrarian feature. It was less heterogeneous than in Russia. So you can't just decide you're going to, if grain prices fall, you're going to send your serfs to work in shipbuilding in Hamburg. The Sheremetyevs could do that. That's not something you can do in Prussia. In principle, serfs were protected against attempts by lords to alter the terms of their tenurial contracts, so to raise their obligations or to expropriate them. They had a legal right to bring suit in princely courts or even in imperial courts in territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when I say in principle, it's to acknowledge that in practice, it didn't always work this way. So it doesn't mean that this legal right was always available or it always favored the peasants, but it existed. And it ended up being a useful tool for the Hohenzollern later on, for reasons I'll explain. There was an enormous amount of variation over space and time, so different balances of power across territories. In the eastern lands, nobles' power was more concentrated. And then, of course, after 1701, you have part of Prussia that's in the Holy Roman Empire and part that's outside. And so you have somewhat different institutional frameworks across these scattered territories. That said, there is this larger legal framework, and I use the term loosely because I think this is developing over time, this system of law and courts that unites disparate territories, and it makes building administration somewhat less onerous than in the case of Russia. And I need to make clear here that I'm not saying Russia did not have a system of law and courts. It did, of course it did, but it looked very, very different. And the way it was used was very different. There's a remarkable uniformity to legal practices and mechanisms of conflict resolution in Western European societies that's not the same in Russia. And the differences in the archives, again, make this clear, going back to my earlier comments on fiscal capacity. These differences really come into stark relief in a comparative context. I mean, I think that for many Europeanists working on these societies, this is just part of the wallpaper. This is part of the background. Yes, that there are these legal ways of framing things, that that privileges are formalized, that you have courts. This is not what we see from the Russian side. It looks a lot different. Okay, so serfdom limits the state's ability to extract surpluses from enserfed peasants. State taxation of serfs is competition with nobles, and they resist. And so here I would point to the fact that the Russian poll tax remains largely unchanged over more than a century from the time it was introduced under Peter. We see, and I should also point out that it was not onerous And I don't say that just because I happen to work on an estate that had some of the richest serfs in Russia, but a working paper by Igor Fedyukin and Yelena Korchmina looks at arrears in state taxes in, I think it's Ryazan province, some different from the place I've studied, and they also find that it's not onerous. There are not enormous arrears, and this inability to get at these revenues must be extremely vexing. As I think of the context of the Sheremetyevys, who have serfs who become some of the richest people in Russia. So Grachov, the textile industrialist, he's a Sheremetyev serf. He's a millionaire, and yet his state tax will still be 86 silver kopecks or whatever it is. So there's a lot of potential there that they can't get at. And there are a lot of examples of outright competition in Prussia after the 30 Years' War. And I mentioned before, it's a little trickier there because the taxes are fixed to the holdings, but what you'll see are especially after the 30 Years' War, nobles say, hey, how about, in order to lure serfs back, in order to lure peasants to take our holdings, we give them, say, 3 years off paying state taxes. And the great elector says, no way, we can't afford that. You reduce your own taxes. And then the next set of complaints we see from the nobles is about the fact that the state then turns around and offers peasants 5 years off state taxes on its own royal demesne lands. So there are some nice examples of this constant competition over serf rents. So in both cases, the state had to resort to other ways of finding revenues, whether that's indirect taxes, reform of the royal demesne lands, and so on. And as we all know, the Hohenzollern managed to grab any surpluses they can extract, and gradually, I mean, it's not this smooth process, it's fits and starts. They expand their administrative capacity, their tax and military administration and oversight, and start to build up this central state. So the Romanovs make similar attempts to increase their take, but without, as far as we can tell, referring to the challenges I mentioned earlier, significant success. So on the eve of reform, and in both of these cases, it's a shock imposed by war that hastens the end of serfdom, and a lot is made of that in the various literatures, but the differences between them couldn't be more stark. By the time of its defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia looks very different. It is, as I say, uncontroversial to say that a stronger, more centralized state is in evidence. And this defeat just kind of pushes further the process that has been underway for some time. In the Russian case, the defeat in the Crimean War gives the crown the political capital to start the emancipation process. But institutionally, the structure of society hasn't changed much, and the state still lacks the administrative and fiscal capacity to effect a reform on its terms. So the political, capacity, the political capital comes from this realization, and it's not as if emancipation hasn't been talked about for some time. It has. But this realization that Russia is not keeping up with its Western rivals, and that there really needs to be done to free up revenues to invest more in military capacity. And so this is the moment when things come together, and it seems like this might happen. So they're able to declare an end to serfdom, but they can't administer it or subsidize it. That falls on the peasants in the end. And in the process, those who are in elite positions under serfdom managed to really capture the reform process. So the assignment of property rights, the state has to call on the nobles to tell them how they want to allocate the lands, which ones go to what will be the newly free peasantry, which ones remain theirs. They are going to need the commune to administer tax policy, conscription, to the obligation payments. And there are not, where in the Prussian case, as I mentioned before, you have this system of law that can be extended outward. New administrative institutions need to be created from scratch. And they do this in a way that, again, highlights differences. So they're more exclusive than inclusive. So you're going to have peasant law and peasant courts. And in the end, they realize that they just, at the end of the century, they need to start planning a new land reform, because this one did not achieve its aims. So what made the difference? Well, there are a number of things I talk about in the book that are, that probably did matter in some ways, that there are different social equilibria. That diagram that I showed before, right? The rent-seeking power was more diffuse in Central Europe than in Russia, where it's much more concentrated in the hands of nobles. So it might be easier to divide and conquer, or easier to extract from a bunch of different groups than the one group that who really has a lockhold on a large part of the population. The question of internal versus external threats. So the Prussian crown was very focused on external threats, the Habsburgs in particular. And in Russia, we have this long history of intense intra-elite conflict. So the Russian crown is constantly facing internal threats, even before the time of troubles, but really straight through. And you think of the number of coup d'état or threats to the crown, it's really every other Tsar, maybe more. So that may pose barriers to creating these kinds of institutions, or for wresting privileges away from a group that's already feeling quite hostile toward you, or that threatens your power. Geography, the Prussian territories were quite dispersed, though they did have this, this larger governing framework that I mentioned before to connect them. Russian territory was very vast, and it's expanding eastward. Institutional heterogeneity. So what I mentioned before, Prussia being partly in the empire, partly out, also taking over lands that had already an institutional framework in place there. This lent a certain, again, like the social equilibria, a form of divide and conquer. You could get different things from different places. But the one I want to focus on for the last 8 minutes of the talk is this notion of different institutional endowments, this notion of property rights and accepted mechanisms for enforcement of them in Prussia, and how that was different. So one thing that really jumps out at one when one is looking at the way these things worked in a European context from outside is that all groups, these different rent-seeking groups, use legal venues and legal arguments to negotiate and renegotiate their privileges and obligations. And the existence of property rights and contract enforcement and administration of these made all kinds of other reforms easier. Demesne form, for instance, and I could go down that road, but I won't in the interest of time. So we see in the archive, we've documented litigation at the estate level. Whether it increased over time is something I was hoping to investigate while here in Germany, but COVID has thwarted me. But that would be interesting to find out whether we see any variation over time. Peasants suing their landlords in princely courts. And this raised the costs of serfdom to landlords in interesting ways. A lot of times when we see an estate that's noted to be using wage labor, it's also one that's engaged in a protracted legal battle with their serfs. And I think that that's important, because one thing one might, I suppose, respond with is, serfs were serfs really likely to win these cases they brought to the princely courts? And I think the chances are probably, the odds are probably against them. This is, there are the cases that one hears about where the serfs were successful obviously make their way into the literature because they're the one that one knows about. But I don't think that that is problematic for the overall argument here, because this was a really useful way of running out the clock. The princely courts, the imperial courts, were extremely overloaded. It took a really long time to litigate. And while the case is pending, they could resist any extra obligations. And it does then, as I said, raise costs to landlords. Litigation raises costs to them running these estates using serf labor. Peasants, when they went to court, often used the argument that landlord demands are undermining their ability to pay their taxes to the state. And then we have the nobles collectively, repeatedly at intervals, imploring the crown to stop allowing peasant suits and to uphold their monopoly rights to dispense justice, to which the crown repeatedly replies, but of course we have to allow all our subjects access to due process. And one can see how it benefited the crown, not only in driving a wedge between the peasants and the landlords, but also constraining the extent to which landlords could extract revenues, could levy new obligations, could compete with them for serf rents. And after emancipation, this existing legal framework could be extended to more people, and it could be adapted to different kinds of transactions. So one of the things I'm really interested in is the way we see these forms, these kinds of institutions evolve and grow over time. Now, for any of this to happen, an acknowledged system of property rights and enforcement had to exist in the first place. So I'm not going to add an origins story to the end of this talk, but I will point out that rulers had a choice of whether they were going to enforce those property rights in their princely courts. But in order to decide that they were going to, there had to be acceptance that it was their right to do that. So the tool was there for them. They could decide whether to use it. In Russia, the variation in procedures for dispute resolution varied across estates. So we don't see anything like the manorial court as Europeanists would understand it, as medievalists would understand it. There are no clearly assigned property rights in Europe, or in Russia. There's no cadastre. So as I mentioned before, when it's time to implement land reform on both the state domains and the private lands, there's really no way of knowing clearly whose is what and what the mechanism will be for enforcing that. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of these, but they're all connected. And the point I want to make is that that the Russian state did not have this tool to fall back on, and it could not say, okay, we can start pushing back against noble landlords by enforcing property rights for peasants. And it meant that they remained constrained in their battle against the noble landlords for the rents that they're trying to obtain. And after emancipation, as I mentioned before, there's no system that can be extended to the newly free peasants, right? All of these institutions have to be created from scratch, more or less. So, okay, how are we going to do this? We need to get some judges. We need to find courts. We need to a body of peasant law. So it's really a very different situation. Now, why do I think this matters? Or why do I think this particular difference is so important? First of all, in the Prussian case, as I said, it jumps out at one. It jumps out at one in all of the histories of serfdom, of conflict, of state formation in Europe. And it looks very different from the vantage point of Russia. So this comes up in the sources again and again, this legal dimension. Second, what we observe for Prussia is not unlike processes historians have described for other parts of Europe. So the extension of recourse beyond seigneurial jurisdiction for enforcement of tenancy terms and property rights is relevant to the decline of medieval serfdom as well. And probably the best documented case for this is England, where the gradual integration of the court system over the medieval and early modern period has been studied and is referred to in the context of the decline of serfdom. The extension to serfs, to all, of access to the royal courts, this undercutting the juridical monopolies of landlords, which happens well in advance of the Black Death, so a century or two before. And so there's this gradual shift. There is this tool that is there, and it's being expanded and it's being used. We see versions of this in France, the parts of France where lordship is especially strong, and where you have these residual feudal arrangements. Later, Burgundy is a place that everyone that everyone points to in the early modern period. But these conflicts there between peasants and landlords, appeals to higher courts, the involvement of the state, that's there. Western Central Europe, the same thing in the medieval period throughout all of these territories, similar conflicts between lords and princes, and often the church, monasteries, and the appeal to legal recourse. So law, and especially the rights to enforcement mechanisms, enforcement services, seem to have been a tool that rulers used in this competition for surpluses. And it did erode the foundations of serfdom over time as states acquired greater administrative and fiscal strength. And so this is my last, I won't be able to dwell on the larger implications because we're out of time, but I do want to say that I think serfdom offers a really interesting lens through which to view institutional change, and there are certain implications for the institutions literature and the institutional origins literature. And those things I would highlight are this idea that law and enforcement mechanisms were a tool European rulers could draw on for extractive aims. So they end up being these kind of inclusive political institutions. Everyone has this right. Everyone, the property rights will be enforced. But the goal in using it and extending it to everyone is clearly to extend the taxable population, to fight back competitors, put a constraint on competitors. This was not something done by design, right? So states used whatever they had at their disposal to further their short-term aims. It just so happens that it was not a tool the Russian state had available to it. We don't see it there. And so, one suggestion is, rather than a system, this sort of system of contract enforcement, property rights, this institutional system created by strong central states, these institutions may have been critical in enabling the emergence of strong central states in Europe. And they clearly have very deep roots. And the last thing I will say is that I have found serfdom a really productive lens through which to view these things, and especially Russian serfdom, because, and this is an unusual case where Russia has very different institutions, but they're similar enough to Europe, where the comparison is really productive because one isn't comparing two completely different entities. Serfdom looks a lot alike across these places, but when we really look into the way it works, the inner mechanisms, we can see in clear relief what the differences were. I will stop. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Tracy. This was wonderful, and I mean, part of me wishes you'd have had more time to speak more about those broader implications, because I think you made it very clear how, bringing in especially the Russian case in that debate about institution can really yield new ideas. But I am not going to abuse my position as moderator, because there are plenty of questions here. So let me start with a question from François Velde. If that's the question he asked towards the middle of the talk, when you discussed, why the state had to give in to landlords the enforcement of mobility restrictions. So the question is, if the state couldn't enforce mobility restrictions, what was the landlord's incentive to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think enforcement is one of these really big blind spots in our understanding of how a lot of these things worked, how a lot of these institutions functioned. There's a lot of hypothesized enforcement going on in studies of serfdom. As far as I can tell, they did it the state did it inadvertently through, or indirectly, by allowing, fining, say, landlords who tried to recruit other serfs from their neighbors, or by the question then comes down to how did they enforce these fines? And I think there must be a sort of agreement somehow among landlords where they accept this and they stop doing this sort of thing. I really don't know why. Why would they not go on trying to recruit others? I'm just thinking aloud. So no, your question is a good one, and enforcement is something that, as I say, it's a really in terms of evidence, it's really not clear.
Actually, the next question is also on enforcement, but for the enforcement of increased legal protections for serfs in Prussia. So were they actually enforced, and did serfs actually use the courts and legal protections available? I mean, I think you can answer this quickly because you
exactly. So
you discussed that later in the talk.
Yeah, I think they landlords could try and stop them from using it, and often they did, I think. But my argument is that the fact that they were there and some serfs did use them was enough to make a difference, and for also to encourage landlords to try and make sure, to try and encourage the state to make sure that serfs knew that they had access to the state courts. So yeah, some did, and it mattered.
Thank you, Tracy. Next question from Michael Huberman. There were big changes in the international economy over the century. Is Russia insulated from the grain invasion? Well, I think it was partly responsible for it, but maybe you want to.
That's again, these are all really interesting questions about the internal dynamics. And I see that, you know, the question about Markiewicz and Żurawskie, this might speak to that as well, what I'm going to say. So I don't know that Russia's insulated. I mean, I was looking at it from the perspective of landlords being insulated in the sense that they can shift their labor around in a way if grain prices fall. But one of the things that I found really interesting when I was looking at serfdom at the micro level was that policies the state created for welfare provision, so having grain stores, led at least some landlords, the Sheremetyevo's were certainly a case, to insist that serfs cultivate their allotments, even when it was clear that there was very little, their labor was allocated better elsewhere. So for instance, I find serfs who are hiring people to cultivate their land because they would be fined or punished if they didn't. And they're going off to work in Helsinki or Odessa or St. Petersburg. So clearly they did not think, if they'd had the choice, they would have just left that land and gone off and worked somewhere else. Grain prices remain low. One of the comments that foreign visitors to Russia remark on all the time is the difference in the grain wage. Trying to put those micro level observations together with this larger macro story about the economy would be worth doing. I haven't done it, and I know that there have been macro studies of grain prices and fluctuations in Mironov's work, for instance, but I myself have been puzzled by how that fits with what I've observed at the state level. And just to kind of round that off with the Markiewicz-Żurawskie comment, I think that elimination of serfdom, emancipation, would have had the effect of making it possible for serfs like the ones that I was talking about to just leave and go work somewhere else and not be obligated to work that land. And then if grain production is lower, then prices might rise, returns to productivity. There'd be a greater incentive to work land in certain places differently. So I think micro level policies probably changed as a result of the emancipation, and that could lead to greater agricultural productivity. But the larger institutional structure I described was not budged by that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so I take it this also answers Anthony Santana's question.
That's what I was aiming for.
Yeah. And I just put together the next two questions by Timur Natkov and Pavel Charas, because they're both really about differences within the Russian Empire, and how those differences affected the implementation of the reforms. So to quote from Timur's question, did Western provinces demonstrate a higher level of state capacity, at least in some dimensions? And how did this affect the shape of emancipation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's one example I want to give off the top of my head that speaks to these differences that I talked about in institutional structure, and that has to do with it has to do with the Baltics and the Germanic nobility in the Baltics. So not so much Poland, Lithuania, but Livonia. And what we observe is the nobility in the Baltics petitioning the crown, the Tsar, for legal legal formalization of their privileges. They want this to be enshrined in law, and this never goes anywhere. They seem to be just ignored. And on the one hand, one could say, oh, this is an almost comical articulation of, two people, two groups not understanding one another. Their institutional structures were so different. And then when I start thinking about that, I think, maybe it's true, there wouldn't have been any mechanisms to do anything with that if they had formalized those legally. I'm not sure how they would, how they would be able to enforce them. But it's also true that one could imagine, from the point of view of the Russian crown, like, why would we want to tie our hands in this way? Why would we legally formalize these? So even though I'm not addressing your question directly, I think the point is that yes, there were differences between those different parts of the Russian Empire, and I think that they weren't able to, even if they had formerly a system that was more like Prussia, they didn't. It didn't help them so much in the Russian context, or maybe it did, because without the constraints of that legal system, they could encroach on their subjects' rights, to a much greater extent. So it's an interesting question. It works both ways, actually.
Great. We've got another 4 minutes for questions. There's a new question from Anis Marakshi. How does serfdom and ancient sharecropping compare?
I would like to know too. That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether sharecropping involved. There are lots of different kinds of early modern or late medieval, early modern sharecropping that didn't involve formal mobility restrictions in the same sort of way. So even if they were effectively constrained by the obligations they owed the landlord, so maybe there were a lot of. I wouldn't be surprised if there were a lot of similarities in practice, but institutionally they probably had different features. But if anyone in the audience has any idea, I'd like to know too.
I think I've got a question from Rui. Yeah, you could unmute yourself, Rui, to ask your question.
Thank you. Yes, I can. Tracy, first of all, thanks a lot for the fascinating presentation. And I'm really taken by your implication slide, the last one. And most of the questions have been very much about Russia. But did I read it right? You're sort of trying to revisit in a sensible way the legal origins arguments, right? Not in the Manichaean way they've been put to circulate. So I'm really interested to know a little bit more about what's your thought about this legal advantage in Prussia, right? And whether you find some, thinking empirically, whether you find some differences between the part of Prussia within the Holy Roman Empire and outside of it.
Okay, and you've got only 2 minutes to answer the question, and I want to mention that Anis Marakshi was referring to Maghrebi sharecropping systems, but please answer Rui's question, and then we shall move into the informal.
Okay, so I have 2 minutes to address the implications for the institution's literature, which is very hard. So I do think that there were differences in that. Of course, the part of Prussia that's in the Holy Roman Empire has an appeal beyond the Hohenzollern, right? Which they were not necessarily delighted by. But I do think that when we're thinking about where these institutions come from, and that is always in this literature, it's there on institutions. There are a lot of tensions. States, strong central states can create these inclusive institutions, but on the other hand, we can't engineer it. I think that what is interesting about this is we see from the medieval period, earlier in the medieval period, so I would say 8th century even, where I can think of concrete evidence, we see these processes developing, and over time, and this is related to the Holy Roman Empire case, we start to see courts at the local level, so manorial courts, say town courts, so all kind of resembling higher courts, and we see canon law courts coming into existence. And so there's clearly a, you know, an influence of the church and Rome here, this long tradition. But the Holy Roman Empire has this whole system, and we see it filtering down right to the seigneurial courts, the way they run their courts, the way the Hohenzollern run their courts. It's very similar to the way the court system and legal system works in the Holy Roman Empire, with the appellate courts and with the formally defined legal privileges and so on. Okay, well, perfect timing, Tracy, and thank you so much to Tracy. Thank you for the wonderful paper. I think we will, because there were some questions about that at the beginning. I think we will put up the slides on the website. And yeah, and thanks to the audience. And as usual, people should feel free to stay for a more informal discussion, but which I think will be a continuation, really. But I will, you know, to give a formal sense that we're moving into a different part, I will stay quiet for 3 seconds. Thank you and bye. Okay. Okay.
Hi, Tracy. Can I ask you a question?
I can, please.
Or comment or whatever. One thing I was interested in, and it's kind of a Abner Greif type of argument, is to what extent there's differences in the way that the nobility interact among themselves and in terms of enforcing these things. Because if it's a strong coalition, a la Greif, which was something that on a regional basis at least was probably operating in Western Europe in the early medieval period, and then it disintegrated. Then this relationship between state enforcement and endogenous enforcement by the group is something that could not just be dependent necessarily on the state's power, but also on the cohesion of the nobility amongst themselves, the amount of competition between them, and collusion, etc.
Yeah, so I'm always frustrated by I guess the sort of tendency toward the binary in this and in these literatures. So either it's, you know, it's informal enforcement or it's formal enforcement. It's inclusive institutions or it's extractive institutions. And I think what we observe, you know, on the ground is that there's always a bit of both. There's all of these at work, and so I guess I see it less as, you know, you have these informal groups who are who enforce their agreements, and then you get formal institutions that do away with this. I think that there are probably these coalitions, and in a way this speaks to that question about, you know, the incentive for nobles to adhere to mobility restrictions. I think that there are these agreements that are informal working alongside, you know, at the same time as these formal forms of enforcement. But I think that they're probably, and this is really speculation, I think that they are probably they're interrelated. I think that, you know, the character they have is probably related to the fact that there is a formal structure. There is a formal structure there. I mean, it raises a lot of questions about, you know, where territory we don't love to venture into, or at least I don't, but about norms and about, you know, these legal procedures. You know, I said that there has to be this understood notion that there are these property rights and that the prince has the right to enforce them. So everyone has to agree on that and accept for them to step in and say, now we're going to start enforcing this actually and try and loosen up your privilege. So I guess I guess it's not really an either or, but I do think that we can't rule out the possibility of these informal mechanisms working together. I think that, if I could just go back to a minute to Rui's question as well on the institutions literature. The way that I see this and the evolution of this process is that you have a mechanism for resolving a certain kind of dispute, and it works in that case. So why not extend that to another kind of dispute when that comes up? Why not extend that again to something else? And so when we use it for property rights in a medieval context and early modern context, but then when financial markets start to get more sophisticated and you have these more sophisticated forms of property, why not extend it to that as well? It's all, there's the core of this system that then just we keep building on and extending outward, if that makes sense. And in Russia, you don't see that system. That's it.
No, and that's what I sorry, David. That's
you go.
What I find fascinating, right? Because if you read Acemoglu and Johnson and James Robinson, they have this clear hierarchy of institutions, right? To distinguish between political and legal institutions. Yep. Legal are the derivation of the political, right? So you're just reframing, you're turning it around, which is fascinating.
I think I've always thought it was very artificial to try and isolate political and economic institutions as well, right? And it's how does that work exactly? It works for a model, but it doesn't necessarily work for our understanding of how these things evolved or how they worked.
Yeah, no, obviously the question of the where the state fits in the institutions is the wonderful thing here. I wanted to now that we've drifted into the informal part, I wondered if I could ask Tracy a question, not about Russia really, but I was struck at the beginning when you described what you a serfdom weak state equilibrium, and which I think is really interesting. And I guess my question is simply, to what extent can you extend this to slavery in the Americas or not? You must have had this question before.
I had it recently, and my answer was, I don't work on slavery. I don't know. And I was told then, oh no, that's a cop out. I think, the reason I'm reluctant to say anything concrete is because this view I have of serfdom is really emerged from a kind of understanding of how the whole context of European institutions and European politics. And I feel like the societies that had serfdom, I don't know them as well, but I guess I know that there are ways in which I could extend what I'm saying to unfree labor more generally and incorporate, for instance, some Fogel and Engerman. I have to think about how to do that, but more to the point, I'm not sure about a weak state, but I do think that there's no reason to assume that the same kind of institutional same kind of institutional configuration doesn't apply, and that access to the labor, the taxation potential of slaves, didn't matter to states in those places. But of course, they all have very different histories and different histories of abolition as well. But I do need it's a good question, and I really should think about how to answer it.
Well, I can only speculate, but the fiscal incentives would be different. But it's true that at least in the Caribbean, the colonial state was often extremely weak. So I think there would be ways of extending possibly your model with some very important modification. I just wanted to go back to some questions. There's one by Antonios Paraskos did the existence of more industrial factories in Prussia and generally in Germany play a significant role in the 19th century?
I think the existence of a more clearly defined set of property rights and enforcement mechanisms mattered to the existence of more industrial factories in Prussia than in Russia. Let me put it that way. Rather than the other way around. I think that you know but it does raise questions. I mean, the Prussian case is really interesting because in the institutions literature, so much is viewed from the English experience, from the British experience, right? And that is not the way. You have this convergence later on. These other places, Prussia, Germany, France, they get there too, and with a very different institutional equilibrium. And, you know, Prussia has a very strong state. As I said, it's a cliche, but this whole notion, again, going back to the institutions literature, about some kind of uniform check on the executive that is critical. Like how do we define that? Because Prussian, it's state-led industrialization, and the state is involved in everything. And you know, is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? Interesting, I think, for the interesting questions arise for the taxonomy, the institutional taxonomy that's set out in the literature, which is very much, as I say, based on the atypical English experience, and then extended outward.
Yeah, Anglocentrism. I'm speaking from London, so I know all about it. There's a question from Timur Natkov about the role of ideas in the implementation of reform, and I guess it's specifically the ideas from the Russian elites, but maybe you can say a few words more generally also.
Yeah,
what you think about ideas, do they matter or not?
Yeah, I think ideas are complicated. I think that especially in politics, I think that the ideas that we see expressed by these people in the reform, making reform legislation, are often ones that they saw as kind of furthering some aim that they wanted anyway, as a kind of rhetoric. But I'm not sure. I mean, the question about the commune is very complicated, but a short answer would be, naturally the nobility wants to preserve communal land tenure, because the deal with Russian emancipation is that no one can leave the commune until they've paid off their share of the redemption fees from the commune. So this is a captive labor force for the nobility if you're maintaining communal landholder. I don't think we need to invoke ideas about the commune and its mystical, its ancient mystical origins. They had a very clear incentive for wanting to keep it. I'm not sure about anti-market or anti-capitalist. I will just quickly say that they certainly serfdom did not create incentives for noble elites to allocate their resources in the kind of projects we observe in Britain or France or in other places in the early modern period, because, as I said, you could just figure out where the rents would be, send your serfs there, and extract from them. They could just move them around. It really disincentivized a lot of innovation in that way.
Okay. If there would be time for a last question, if anyone, I can even let someone speak if they would like to speak.
Shall I speculate on the Stolypin reforms of 1906?
I'm sorry.
I will just say that I don't think they really had time to bear fruit because the weakness of the state left it susceptible to the disastrous World War I performance, and then the Bolshevik coup later. And so whether I will just express as my last word skepticism for all the reasons I've mentioned in this talk. So they would really be they would have to undertake the construction of an entirely new kind of legal property rights regime with clear assignment and enforcement mechanisms in order for this to work. I'm a little bit more of a pessimist with regard to Russia. And a lot of people think, if the revolution hadn't happened, or there'd be convergence, and I'm a bit skeptical for all the reasons I've set out here.
Okay, well, that's great. It was a very conclusive answer, bang on time. So I guess this is the end. And do we just
we say adieu?
We say adieu.
We thank our speaker again. Thank you very much.
It's so
thank you, everyone.
Awkward. Well, thank you very much, Tracy. This was really wonderful.
Thanks, a pleasure.
Thanks for coming.
Good to see you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.